Hi, I'm Kyle Scheidler, Director of the Threat Information Office at the Center for Security Policy. We're here today with Senior Fellow for the Center for Security Policy, Steve Coughlin, and we're going to talk a little bit about the recent declaration of a caliphate by the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham. So Steve, how do you see this declaration by ISIS?
Well, I see it in many respects. First of all, I see it as a continuation of what they've been doing since it was the Zarqawi terror network in Iraq and then al-Qaeda in Iraq. They published these as well. I also see it as a, you're talking about the promise of, this is the promise of Allah. I also see it as a triumphal statement that they have, a victory statement that they have procured or secured their territory, and of course we see that they're claiming a caliphate. You know, the one of the things I kind of take a look at is they're going through their list of what they think is important, and they say here we have the flag of the Islamic State, the borders of the old leaders have been destroyed, soldiers were killed, imprisoned, or defeated, the kuffar infidels have been disgraced. The people of Bid'ah, heresy, the people who are governing not according to Islamic law in those countries where they overtook it, have been humiliated. They've imposed the jizya. They have imposed hudud laws. Now that becomes very interesting because it's in furtherance of the hudud penalties that they executed all those people that was on the news recently, which gave rise to Ali Bieri ridiculing people for bringing out the fact that ISIS was implementing hudud penalties in those executions, and then basically talked about the inevitability of the caliphate, and we needed to get on, referring, I do believe, to the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where he basically said we've already acceded to that because we have a special envoy to them. So there is within the local, let's say Muslim Brotherhood connected worldview, a degree of a tip of the hat to what ISIS is doing if we look at what's happening.
And that's a reference to Mohammed El-Biari, Senior Fellow at the Department of Homeland Security.
And his statement with regard to claiming the inevitability of the caliphate, referring to the OIC in the context of praising ISIS for what they have done. And so I think that becomes very interesting. I also think that one of the things you can see from their claim of the caliphate is if you can point to one thing that shows an internal structural weakness, it's not their weakness, it's a weakness to their claim, is the fact that one of the things they said is that graves have been demolished, which kind of points to the fact that ISIS, al-Qaeda in Iraq really, is, and in the Levant, is really coming across as Wahhabi pure, because this becomes the issue that kind of splits Wahhabi Muslims from the more general Sunni population. It divides maybe al-Qaeda from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not as clearly involved in the kind of the pure Wahhabism that you are seeing being expressed here. And of course, what al-Qaeda also did was they did claim to have established a caliphate. Again, because they've done this before in Iraq.
So this is actually, in fact, not their first declaration of caliphate?
No. I do believe sometime around the time in the Zarqawi network or somewhere thereafter there was a claim of caliphate as well. So I do believe.
Okay. You mentioned the hudud punishments, and I think that's interesting because one of the things that opinion makers have stated is that, ISIS is a network more brutal than al-Qaeda. And what few people seem to understand is that the difference is solely that ISIS is viewing itself as an Islamic State and therefore is implementing full Islamic law.
I think the people who tell us what ISIS is or is not are the same people who never got them right to begin with. They never got al-Qaeda right to begin with. They never got the Brotherhood right to begin with. Yes, it is entirely possible that some elements of al-Qaeda are a little grimacing that this group has taken it farther than they might have thought appropriate. But their whole claim to establishing the caliphate and taking praise is precisely because they've implemented these Islamic legal requirements, albeit in a harsh way. I'm not saying they're right for doing it, but I think that this kind of gets folded into the idea that they are claiming to have established the caliphate. And of course, if you go into some some books of Islamic law, they go into this very ornate, very um, um, official discussion about what is entailed in establishing a caliphate, who could become the caliph. But they always come to that third reason about how can you become a caliph, and that is, I do believe the word is, by seizure. And the life's nasty little trick is this: if you're powerful enough to seize the caliphate and hold it, guess what? Your definition of what constitutes proper interpretation of Islamic law becomes the interpretation that prevails. So, yes, I would be among those who would tend to think that al-Qaeda takes an extreme view to things, because I think that their whole agenda is extreme. But if you're a member of al-Qaeda, they can lay down their argument, and that argument at least survives a challenge, and it will win the challenge if they win.
So the question then for ISIS in Iraq is to succeed. For them, success is its own. Success is proof of success.
I think that they can kind of suggest, and as they do, that they are following Islamic legal requirements as they understand them, and they're citing Islamic requirements. Whether or not they're right, there's two ways to say whether or not they're right. In the pure Shariah context of are they right, and let's take a look at the rules, and you'll get a lot of arguments from it. But you'll get al-Qaeda jurists to fire back. There's a second way to answer that question, and that is that there is a sense in Sharia that holding the power is itself legitimizing. They are, unless they're knocked off. Now that's the cynical answer to it, and I would be the first to acknowledge that, but it's also one that's the ground truth. Did they seize power? Are they holding it, and are they expanding on that understanding? And if they do, what is the rule of the caliphate? Is if there is a caliphate, it is a serious offense to challenge the authority of the caliph, even if he is a bad caliph. And punishments will accrue if you try. Well, unless you succeed, in which case it's good to be king. I mean,
it's good to be the king.
And I think that al-Qaeda is making that brash argument, but they're making that brash argument being brash. And I think if they succeed, the success itself becomes a legitimizing factor. I know I repeated myself. But they can point to things to suggest that there's something to that.
I wanted to ask about al-Baghdadi's recent statement. And one of the things in that statement was that it was obligatory for Muslims to emigrate to the Islamic State and to assist them, specifically called, obviously, for fighters, but also for jurists and engineers and religious scholars and teachers and these sorts of things. So, is that a real obligation?
I think that we have to start with the fact. Let's start with a central point. Even if most of the Muslim world legitimately, most of the Sunni Muslim world legitimately does not recognize the Islamic legal basis on which al-Qaeda governs, al-Qaeda recognizes the basis on which they govern. They are certainly getting enough support, financial and otherwise, to maintain this effort, which is substantial, from oil-producing states that then, at least in theory, likewise believe in that vision. So let's start with the fact that under al-Qaeda's understanding of Islamic law, do they believe they are a newly established caliphate fighting jihad to establish their status? And the answer is yes. And in that context, they can claim that all Muslims are required to come to their aid. If they are under the position that there are non-Muslims in Muslim lands, they can basically hit on the idea that there's a mandatory duty of jihad when non-Muslims are in Muslim lands. They can be fought with by any effort, by any effort or all effort. I'm butchering that. And incidentally, that they don't have to cite, let's just say, al-Qaeda's version of Islamic law and jihad to make that. All they have to do is say, under our understanding of Sharia, we're in jihad, and they can then quote normal Islamic law on the duty to fight jihad. And what happens is, how successful will they be? Will be heavily premised on how successful they're perceived to be in that part of the world. And people are going to ride the winning horse. That's exactly what's going to happen. And so I think that I think we should watch for that. I do think, though, however, that a lot of this is posturing. A lot of it's posturing because they're going to go to the low-lying targets because they know that if they try to go into the Kurdish area, they're going to meet with resistance from non-Arab Sunni Muslims who want their own state. They know that if they really go hard into Baghdad and the Shia portions, they're going to be met with harsh resistance. So their whole discussion, this whole declaration is basically laying out a casus belli, if you would, to go into Syria and to go into Jordan and to even maybe foray into Lebanon, although that's where they will also start meeting heavy Shia resistance. This becomes the casus belli for them to foray in those areas where there may not be that much resistance, which will allow them to range freely, creating the illusion of success and avoiding the hard targets.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I understand that they did recently appoint an emir for Lebanon, so it would suggest that this is a target for them. And I think that's interesting for foreign policy analysts to pay attention to, because a lot of the discussion has been about the conflict versus Iran and the Shia-dominated government of Maliki. And people have not paid as much attention to the reality that there's a serious threat here to the border with Jordan and also other territories that are maybe less heavily defended than, Baghdad, the capital.
Oh, I think that you're absolutely right. In fact, I mean, this cuts two ways in a sense. You have these borders that exist only on paper, Jordan, with Syria, even with Lebanon. I mean, they call themselves ISIS, but the word is used often, Levant, and that basically is the greater Syria, including that area. I think that the problem we have with our analysts is they're going to basically say, oh, look at Al-Qaeda, they created an emir. What is this junk? And they're calling for a caliphate. And my point is, take their argument that they follow Islamic law seriously and look at what they're doing based on that. First of all, they're going to consolidate their power where they can. Zarqawi means from Zarqaw. Isn't it Zarqawi or Zarqaw? He was from Jordan. Okay, so he has a base there. So his whole activity is to destabilize the Arab Muslim world. I think what you're going to see from that is that you're going to find that this is going to bring him into conflict with the Sunni non-Wahhabi, non-Takfiri population, because this is where Takfirism is going to run headlong into an aversion to that view of Islamic law outside of the Hanbali / Taymiyan / Wahhabi view of Islamic law. So, but it's the easy targets for them. And it gives them the ability to maintain the fight, create huge press ops, and not engage the big target, which is Iran. And in fact, this is all spoiling for that fight.
Steve, thank you.